Thank you everyone for coming along to the session today on what has science taught us about relationships. And in the next hour and a half you'll learn everything you need to know to make your relationship the best possible relationship it can be. And so what we're going to do is actually give you a little evaluation before, and we're going to contact you in 6 months' time to make sure that your relationship is the best it can be. And we're going to talk to your partner as well. And so you didn't know that, but that's what's going to happen. Only joking. Okay, so thank you for coming along. What would this be if we didn't have an audience? And it's great to see so many people here. Of course, this wouldn't be possible without a whole pile of people who are putting in all this effort to make it successful. And to my right here is Dr. Jerry Brancas, who has done an amazing job to get us all lined up, which is no easy feat, and also to publicise this event and to ensure that we get as many people as possible attending today. So thank you, Jerry. You're an absolute champion. Mandy O'Garrity, who's our media person from Deakin University, was going to be here today, but something else has come up, has done a terrific job of publicising the event. There's been a lot of media play on 774 in particular, and Radio National, and also in some of the press. I believe some of the press are here today as well. So thanks, Mandy, in your absence. And the School of Psychology at Deakin University has sponsored this event. They forked out the money to allow us to hire out the venue and also to subsidise the lunch that will be provided afterwards. However, the main players, the stars, are sitting on the front row here, who are going to tell us all we need to know about how to make our relationships successful, coming at it from a whole lot of different perspectives. So we thank them for giving up their time, volunteering their time to talk with you today, and also Dan Perlman, who's sitting in the front row, who's going to say a few words in a couple of minutes, who has just arrived in time from the US for this event. And so Dan will say a few words about the International Association for Relationships Research after Jerry has gone through a few issues. So thanks everyone. I hope you enjoy the presentations. I hope you enjoy the lunch afterwards. And just one final thing, if you could just make sure that you switch off your mobile phones. Thank you. Jerry.
Thank you, Maria, and I do need to extend my thanks to my partner in crime, Maria McKay. She's been a great supporter of this event, and I think have worked well as a team, as we usually do to put these things on. So thank you for such a lovely crowd coming in today. I think we're expecting some more people. Last time we checked, the theatre sits 200 and we had 195. So there might be some more people coming in, so just ferry them through. I don't want to take up too much time. It's important that we start the event and, as Maria said, listen to the main stars of the show today. What I will do is just quickly outline who we are speaking today. So as you'll see, we have a great lineup of speakers, and we've gotten this as part of the flyer that all of you would have received and heard about in terms of this symposium. So we're starting off with Professor Jeffrey Simpson, who's just sitting to the other side of Maria McKay, from the University of Minnesota. That's going to be followed by myself. And then after that, Maria McKay will give a short talk. Then we have Professor Daniel Russell, who's sitting next to Jeffrey Simpson, from Iowa State University, followed by Carolyn Petrona from Iowa State University, and then Julie Fitness on the far end of the panel will be presenting the final talk. Each of us will talk for 10 minutes, and we'll reserve questions to the end so we have an interactive Q&A type discussion before we have lunch that's going to be served out in the foyer. But to start with, I'd like to pass over to Dan Perlman, who really has literally just landed in the country. It's a Herculean effort for Dan to be here with us today. He is the president of the International Association for Relationship Research. The conference is running as of tomorrow down at the Melbourne Convention Exhibition Centre. If you think what you hear today is interesting, it's a bit of a taster of the science of relationships, We encourage you to grab a ticket. Registrations are still being taken, and they are on the IALR website that you can see listed down here. The last thing I will say is please make sure that if you do have any mobile phones, there's no recording of this event. While it's a public event, we're having it professionally recorded, so we're not allowing any other recording to take place. We'll inform people as to how they can access these things in due course. Thank you so much for your attendance. It's lovely to see such a great crowd. We hope you enjoy. Welcome to the symposium. Over to you, Tom.
Well, let me echo Jerry's invitation to you to come to the IR conference starting tomorrow night if you'd like. As president of IR, I'm very pleased to be here in Melbourne. One of the reasons that IR is meeting here, in addition to the lovely Melbourne city, is the caliber of research on close relationships that's being done here in Australia. Really, Australia is one of the world's leading countries for research. It's most generous of the faculty at Deakin and other Australian universities to be hosting our 2014 meeting of our organization. The organizing committee, chaired by Jerry, and the program committee have been hard at work arranging an exciting world-class event. The Deakin University School of Psychology, led by Greg Tooley, has been wonderfully supportive, and I want, on behalf of IR, to express our very deepest thanks. Besides saying thank you, I want to take just 3 or 4 seconds, really, to reflect on why I consider relationships to be so important, and perhaps some of the talks will embellish on this. Humans are essentially a social animal. At the most basic level, relationships are important because, as we all know, we require a partner to reproduce. Having relationships fosters the survival of our society, and when you look around at a wonderful room like this, imagine trying to do it all by yourself. Working together is essential for it. Furthermore, we spend much of our lives with others. Roughly 70% of our waking hours are in the presence of other people. And not only do we spend a lot of time with other people, but in opinion polls, people say that relationships are very important to them. I looked at one poll in which family relationships came out as more important than the following other things: work, religion, making money, good health, and having leisure activities. So we really think that relationships are important. A final reason why relationships are important is their sequelae. I realize that sometimes relationships can be a big hassle, there can be disappointments, breakups, etc. But on the other hand, research shows people are generally in better moods when they are with others, and people in relationships have greater life satisfaction, better health, and longer life expectancies. As I expect other speakers today will indicate, the Beatles are right. We get along with a little help from our friends. So my best wishes to you in having friendly interactions today and positive relationships in your lives. Thank you.
I just want to thank Jerry and Marita for organizing this conference. They've done a lot of work behind the scenes in Australia and abroad to advance the study of relationships in really positive directions. And I really want to thank them because they really do an amazing amount of work for our field and for the study of relationships. Thank you. What I want to do in the next 10 minutes is just review some of the work that we've been doing with the longitudinal data set at the University of Minnesota, which tries to ask the question, does what happens to you as a child early in life with regard to how you're cared for by your parents, does that have any lasting effect on what your romantic relationships are like 20 or 30 years later? And the tentative answer is yes, in some ways, but it's a lot more complicated than just there being a direct link from how you're treated early in life as a child to what your relationships are like in terms of how you resolve conflict, for example, with your partner 20 or so years later. John Bowlby argued that early social experiences with caregivers generate working models, which are expectancies and attitudes that should affect how people think and feel and behave in later relationships. This is a core idea of attachment theory, and you can think of working models as like schemas, expectancies. If I do this, then this is what my partner will do, or if this happens, then that will happen. And these experiences ought to be linked to what happens in later relationships through different developmental pathways. So many years ago, someone named Waddington developed what he called the epigenetic landscape. And the purpose of this model was to show how individuals can, based upon how the experiences that they have and who they are as people genetically and in terms of social experiences, how they develop down across time and down pathways. So one way to think about this is you've got an individual up here, the ball at the top of the hill, and if they experience, for example, positive parenting, and they develop positive working models where they think they're worthy of love and affection, and they think their partners are going to be there for them, they probably will develop down a more positive pathway in the light, and they're going to trust people later on, and they're going to have more positive relationships. But if an individual experiences abuse or trauma or negative parenting, they will take a different trajectory down a more dark pathway, symbolized there on the right, and that should affect in some way, shape, or form whether they trust people and the extent to which they regulate their emotions effectively when they have conflict and things such as this. And so this is the general idea we've been following. What are these developmental trajectories or pathways, and can you empirically test and document whether or not there are links, and what are the pathways through which these links actually exist. Attachment theory, John Bowlby's attachment theory has a lot to say about this. So Bowlby has argued that early caregiving experiences should especially forecast the expression and the experience of positive in relation to negative emotions in relationships. And so the basic idea here, and there's a lot of cross-sectional work showing this, that if you receive positive parenting and have a secure attachment history, you should be more likely, when you're experiencing conflict, for example, to view it as a constructive challenge and experience more positive emotions relative to negative emotions. Because conflict is an opportunity to grow and develop if you trust that you and your partner are in this together and you have positive working models. But if you are insecurely attached, if you received, for example, inconsistent parenting as a young child, or if you were rebuffed or rejected by your parents, so you mistrust people in general, attachment figures later in life, then you might have a more difficult time regulating your emotions, and negative emotions might override positive ones, which causes problems in relationships. And so that's the general idea. So we have a sample of 180 people who followed literally from before they were born. The sample is 45% female, 55% male. Everyone was born in 1975 or 1976 in Minneapolis. The current subsample I want to talk about is 78 people who participated with their romantic partners when they were between 20 and 23 years old. And what we did basically in the study, so one person was the participant we've been studying and measuring across time. The other participant was their romantic partner on whom we had no developmental information. We had both partners report the frequency of positive and negative emotions in their relationship, and then we had them try to resolve the most important problem in their relationship while we videotaped it, and then we coded those videotapes for the expression of different kinds of conflict tactics and the expression of positive and negative sentiment and affect during these discussions. So the model we tested, basically, and I can't go into much detail given time, was one like this. When the participants were a year old, they were videotaped with their mother in a stressful situation. And securely attached people, basically, who have received good parenting, when they're upset as children, what they do is they turn to their parents, in this case their mother, for comfort and support, and they calm down quickly. Insecure people, on the other hand, don't derive comfort from their parents, typically because they've not received good sensitive parenting. So we had measures of the target participants' attachment security, secure or insecure, dichotomously coded, at 12 months. We had measures of how they were functioning with their romantic partner at age 20 to 23, both self-reported emotions and ratings of behavioral expression of emotions in this conflict discussion task. We also had information about the target, the participant, not the partner. In grade school, how competent were they in the classroom, rated by their first, second, and third grade teachers, and also the extent to which they had secure relationships with their best same-sex friends in high school at around age 16. And so what we found basically in the study was as follows. There was a link, you can see it right here, between attachment security and emotion regulation. So if you were more secure at age 1, videotaped in a stressful situation with your mother, you were more likely to be well regulated in conflict situations with your partner 20 years later. It's a small effect, but it's a significant effect. What's more interesting, I think, is the pathway through which this effect transpires across development. So what we find, to be really concrete, to take one example, is if you're a secure infant at age 1, when you're in first, second, and third grade, those 3 grade school teachers rate you as being a more competent peer in the classroom, someone who's well-liked, respected, a leader among peers, etc. If you're a more competent peer in early grade school, you tend to trust your best friends more and you're more authentic with them in early high school during that critical transition period at age 16. And people who have more friendship security at age 16 are more likely to be well regulated with their romantic partners when trying to resolve a major conflict later on. So what we see here basically is we see a direct effect of early experience on what happens. But the effect depends an awful lot on the other relationships and the other life events that intervene between age 1 and age 20, right up here. So in conclusion, the relationship past is meaningfully linked to the present, but primarily through what occurs in different relationships at intervening stages of development. And so the argument that we like to make is that there is a legacy of early experience. It's not a destiny sort of thing, so you're predetermined to have bad relationships if you were parented poorly or you're insecure. But that legacy does endure. It's still in your head. It's still in your mind. And it may be called up at times when you experience novel events with your current romantic partner and you act in ways that you normally wouldn't. You don't know where it's coming from, but it could be coming from the way you were parented pre-verbally at a very early period of life. Thank you.
All right, everyone. So we turn to the question of what do we look for in a romantic partner? What would we see? What would we want in the ideal romance? And I tell you what, there's a lot of experts out there telling us what to do. Sometimes those experts are our own family. Sometimes they're people like us. And sometimes there are other people out there that are dating experts, etc. And I think if you look at the amount of self-help advice out there, I think there's enough out there to put you into the fetal position if you were trying to work out what to do. Let me give you a case in point to start with. I'm not going to say who this is, but I'm going to tell you that there's some advice on the Yahoo personals about finding the partner you want. You've got to make a list and you've got to check it twice. So let's go through this. Really, when you want to find a romantic partner, you have to become either a private investigator or an investigative journalist. So, this is what some people say. What you've got to do is you've got to interview the person in a way where you can find out how it fits in with what you want. It doesn't mean you've got to sit down with them and go through a bunch of lists and interrogate them. This would scare anyone, I'm glad that they at least admit that. But it does mean you've got to keep your lists in mind. That checklist has got to be there, present, and you've got to work with that checklist. In fact, this individual suggests that maybe it would be nice if we could think of finding a romantic partner a little bit like the way we order at a restaurant. As a starter, I would like someone who's handsome, pretty attractive, would help if they had a decent-sized bank account, and maybe just as a side, it would be good also if they were interested in the same things I was. Now, if you think about it that way, then we pursue with the various lists and interrogation. The What's the first piece of advice that's given? Well, the first thing is you've got to buy a notebook and record your dating experiences. Do it now. The second thing you've got to do is you've got to make some lists, not one list, many lists. Let's go through the lists very quickly. The first list is the 6 musts. This is what the partner must have. If they don't have these things, it's a deal breaker. It's off, don't even pursue, do not go there. Then the second list are the very important. These aren't necessarily deal breakers, but boy, they would help. And then we have the list of the 6 must nots. These are also deal breakers, but this is what you don't want the partner to have. Right? If it is, all bets are off. Bye-bye. Thanks for playing. The fourth one is the list of unlimiteds. These I refer to as the fringe benefits. They're loving, they're caring, and they happen to be a millionaire. Fabulous. And then in the last list, it's time for you to head deep into your mind's eye and envisage what life would be like with the ideal partner. Are you starting to get tired? I know I am. But it continues. Right. So then what we have to do after that is check the dating partner that you've gone out with against your 6 musts. And then you need to come to a series of conclusions. Do they fit all 6 musts? If they do, then go to your next list, your very importance, and then look at your must nots. And if the person gets all the 6 musts, well then it might be worth pursuing it, but make sure you go back over those other lists. If he or she don't fit all the 6 musts, don't go out with it. It's game over. And if you don't have enough information, then you might want to find out a little bit more about it. You might want to engage in another date. Remember to check your lists. Lists are important, check them, read them daily, and when you're relaxed, so you can really let them sink in, and expect that you will meet him or her. They'll come into your life, and do so with an open heart. Now, I don't know how much this is about heart or about mind, right? Here are these things I've just pointed out to you all. But I guess the point of all this is if we went about dating like this, I think I'd just rather go on a holiday because it's hard work and it makes me happy that I'm a married man. What do we have to say about this? There is some truth to all this. It's important to have an idea of what it is that you want and to seek out a partner that's in line with your values. But what does the science of relationship tell us about this? Well, the first thing it tells us is that if we were to ask people about what they look for in a romantic partner, it becomes pretty clear. And in fact, quite a bit of this work has been done by Jeff Simpson and a colleague of his, Garth Fletcher, where if you were to ask people to rate 60 characteristics in a partner, they would group together in 3 broad categories. The first one would be that we look for someone who's warm and trustworthy, loving, caring, and that we have confidence that we can count on them in times of need. The second relates to status and resources, and by that we don't mean a flashy car and millions of dollars in the bank. What we're referring to is that there is someone who has resources that they can bring to the table to ensure that we can have a life together where we're financially secure, we've produced to have children, we can raise them and there's not going to be any poverty, etc. That people have a sense of career progression, because that again gives us a sense of security and safety about the kind of long-term bond we have with someone. And the other is vitality and attractiveness. Of course we know physical attraction matters, but it's more than that. We often know that the people that we are attracted to are often very similar in terms of attractiveness to ourselves. We go for people who are familiar. That's an aspect of attractiveness. But in addition to that is this notion that the person has vitality. What do we mean by that? They seem like a healthy individual. They have a zest for life. Why are these things important? Because according to some work that Jeff Simpson has done with Steve Gangstead, they suggested that these types of categories, the reason that we find them important is because they have some kind of evolutionary underpinning. And what it relates to is the idea that when we try to pair up with someone for a long-term relationship, especially, we're looking for people that have good genes. And by that, what do we mean? That they look healthy, that we're going to have healthy children, and that we can engage in a long lineage of our own bloodline. We're talking about reproductive fitness, keeping our generations alive, one generation to the next. And the other is that these categories come together to talk about having a good investment. That is, we rely on people who are going to take care of us, like a precious investment. That's what lives are. So let's talk a little bit about these broad categories. And one question that's asked is, do men and women look at these categories differently? Do they rate them differently in terms of importance? And the evidence is somewhat supports that, but it's a little more complicated than that the more that we dig into it. There are gender differences. This is some work that's been done by Garth Fletcher along with Jeff, work that's been done in New Zealand. Women relative to men tend to place a greater premium on warmth, trustworthiness, and status and resources when looking for a potential mate. For men, they place greater importance on vitality and attractiveness. But it's not always as cut and dry as that. Once we shift the attention away from importance and we provide you with a scenario where we ask you, so here are some potential mates that you could engage in, and the reality is that when we're looking at romantic partners, we are potentially looking at more than one partner when we're scoping out to get a sense of, will I find an ideal mate? When we do that, things change. Because if we ask someone, who would you choose? Someone who has a lot of money or someone who is warm, then regardless of gender, warmth trumps money, irrespective of whether you're a man or a woman. It becomes more interesting again when we ask you about your goals in a relationship. Are you interested in a short-term relationship, a casual relationship? Or are you interested in a long-term committed relationship? When we do that and we ask you to think about that and expose you to different types of people, someone who's warm and homely, and someone who potentially might be cold but nevertheless may be very attractive, again, both men and women choose a cold and attractive person in a short-term relationship. They go for attraction. But when we go to a long-term relationship, that flips. For men and women, it's about warm and homely, warm and trustworthy. Some of our own work that we've been doing recently suggests that it becomes even more complicated the minute you start to bring in people's relationship histories. A bit like what Jeff was talking about in terms of attachment insecurities. Because these can act as self-fulfilling prophecies, they influence our mind and the way that we look at the world, then it's interesting sometimes what people look for and value in a partner. We find people who avoid intimacy and closeness are attracted to people who have higher degrees of status and resources. When we look at people who are anxious about their relationships and have an incessant need for love, comfort and security, a high need for approval, they especially prefer people who are warm and trustworthy. Another point that we want to make is what happens if your ideals aren't met? They may matter, but what happens? Well, what we found is that for most of us, our partners may fall short of certain ideals. For some of us, our partners match up very closely to our standards, but for some it's not quite the case. What has been found time and time again, very consistent finding, the bigger the shortfall, the poorer the relationship satisfaction. So narrowing the gap is important. What sorts of things are going to influence that gap? Well, the first is how high you set that standard. Because obviously that's the benchmark at which your partner must meet. And the second relates to the extent to which you actually notice these things in your partner, your own perceptions. These influence your judgments. How do we deal with shortfalls though? There's a couple of ways. One thing you could do is you could lower your standard. You can turn around and say, well, maybe my standard is too high. I'm going to lower it, so I'm more flexible in my standard. And that actually narrows the gap between what it is that you want and what your partner is doing. And we find that that is helpful, and lots of people do that. The other is you can attempt to regulate your partner's behaviour. Work by Nikki Overall in New Zealand has done some beautiful work on this. But basically, the greater the gap, the more that you then try to change your partner. So a classic example would be taking out the garbage and then not taking out the garbage. Well, you're going to do something about it if you value that as important. And what we often find is that direct strategies of regulating the partner are the most effective. So most people perceive indirect strategies as being the most effective. You know, if you turn around and say, oh, it would be really nice if sometimes you would think about maybe taking out the garbage. People go, oh, that's a very nice way to say it. Sure, I'll do it. It's not effective. It doesn't lead to a long-term change in partner behaviour. What does? Take out the garbage. Of course, it needs to be conducted in a way with mutual respect, but direct communication does matter when it comes to these sorts of things. The evidence suggests a few other things as well. There's been some interesting work recently that's been done where we ask you the question, do you meet your partner's ideals?
Not does your partner meet your ideals, do you meet your partner's ideals? We find different effects in terms of the emotional consequences of that. Number one, if you fall short of your partner's, if your partner falls short of your ideals, you feel dejection. You feel sad about it, you feel low mood about it. If you're the one that's falling short of your partner's ideals, based on your perception, you feel agitated, anxious, worried, because you know what you're not living up to. Interestingly, some work that we've recently been looking at suggests that a lot of the action may occur under the standard. That is, most people fall below people's standards. We found in some recent studies, 30 to 35% of people would report that their partner is above their standard, well performing above. That raises some interesting questions that we're now going to start tackling. What does it mean if your partner is faring better on these standards? Are you more forgiving if they make a mistake on something? Are you going to cut them some slack? Would you forgive a major or a minor transgression? But what happens if there's a different combination? If you happen to be above your partner's standard, but they're falling below yours, or vice versa? Is there a compensation effect that occurs? One person lifts the other partner up? Is there tension? These are things that we're now exploring. Some final words. One thing that we're currently exploring is that maybe it's just okay to fall short of your partner's standards. And for many people it is. And for many people the gap isn't huge. One of the things that we're exploring now is maybe it's because we accept our partners for who they are, warts and all. But surprisingly, when you talk about this topic of acceptance, and you might think it's widely studied, it's not in relationship science. And that's something that we're commencing as we speak. What we need to come away with realising is that our values influence what we look for in a partner, how we evaluate the partner, but also how we evaluate ourselves. Those things matter. It makes common sense, but sometimes these things fade into the background. And when we think about what we look for in a partner, it's pretty consistent. There are these three broad categories: warmth, trustworthiness, status, resources, and vitality, attractiveness. These things do matter, and they matter to all of us. It's important to have those ideals, but one thing that's very important is to keep them realistic. Some people say keeping high standards is good, because it means that people can shoot for those in a relationship. But if those standards are high but unrealistic, it's dangerous. What it is you're setting up a relationship for a fall. You can have a perfectly good partner set such a high standard that no one is ever going to reach it. You can't reach your own standard. And so a relationship that is functioning perfectly well is deemed as inappropriate. That's where the danger lies. Setting realistic standards matters. If they happen to be high, that's okay. And the last thing that I'd leave you with is, I wouldn't worry too much about making lists. I wouldn't worry about checking them twice. Leave that to the experts, leave that to Santa. Thanks for that.
What I'm going to do is talk about something which neither Jeff nor Jerry have spoken about, and that is the place of sex within relationships. We don't talk about sex. We don't talk about where it fits into relationships, and yet it's an essential aspect of relationships. And in particular, I'm going to talk about how sexual dysfunction impacts on relationships. And it has, as you will see, a major negative effect. The flip side of that, of course, is that a positive sexual experience is very conducive and very enhancing of relationships. But I'm going to come at it from the dysfunction end. Okay, so firstly, where does sex fit in to relationships? How does it actually work? And what we know is that sexuality at any age, whether we're talking about adolescence or whether we talk about old age, it's an interaction between a range of different variables. It's an interaction between our biology, that is, our age, the kinds of medical problems that we might be experiencing, our hormonal levels, so what our physical functioning is like. The psychosocial aspects, and this is whether we are functioning well in terms of depression, anxiety, what our body image is like. So all of those factors feed into how well we are functioning sexually, as well as our relationships. So in psychosocial, I have the the psychology of the individual, how well the individual is functioning, and also how well the relationship is tracking. And we'll unpack this a little bit more in a moment. And finally, cultural. What does our culture, whether we talk about the broader cultural setting or our specific cultural setting within our family or within our smaller cultural group, what does that say about the acceptability of the expression of sexuality for both men and women? What does our society say is an acceptable way of expressing our sexuality? Is it okay for a woman to be sexual, or is it that the woman needs to be quite coy and quite dismissive of sexual interactions? And so in order to understand people's sexual expression, we need to understand all of these different parts. So if we start off with females, and we do look at some general observations about female sexuality, and then we'll go on to males. What we know is that female sexuality, the extent to which females feel sexual and want to engage in sexual activity, is highly contextual, and that it is discontinuous throughout the life cycle. This is not so much the case for men. For women, what we know is their sexual response and their desire ebbs and flows, and is dependent upon the current contextual and relationship factors, as well as historical and biological factors. And so what we know is that for women, fairly soon after childbirth, they're not particularly interested in sex. And that can go on for quite a long period of time. Children are not an aphrodisiac. Children have a major negative effect on women's sexuality. They're just not interested. It's not because they don't want to become pregnant again, it's because they're tired. It's because they are just not interested. I mean, the child might come into the bedroom, they're going to have to get up in a little while to feed the child. Leave me alone. And this is quite normal, but yet this can cause women quite a deal of distress and concern. When the woman is going through the menopause, she may experience vaginal dryness, hot flushes. She can be really quite out of sorts. And if the woman is feeling out of sorts, she's not interested in sex. For guys, they are able to separate these things more. But for women, if they are feeling fatigued, stressed, anxious, depressed, they've got bad body image, they're just feeling not good about themselves, this has a flow-over effect into their relationships and into their sexual expression. As I said, for men, there's more of a separation that occurs. So how does age impact a woman's sexuality? How does this change as the woman gets older? And what we've got are a number of different factors that impact here. We've got the biological factors, and so as I said, go through the menopause, we've got hormones, aging, drugs, so general health. So these factors impact on her sexual expression. Cultural factors, and the reason why I'm emphasising this, I think that we often overlook the role of cultural factors, and yet we know that within families and within broader cultural groups, particularly for women, there are quite strong cultural messages that come out in terms of the acceptability of a woman expressing her sexuality, and so her sexual identity, her social role, and the level of support that she receives. Interpersonal factors, the quality of the relationship is particularly important for women. Not so much for guys, but particularly important for women. And the psychological factors. I have here things like anxiety, depression, body image, fatigue. All of these factors are important for women. And so for women, what we find is that there's there's a high level of overlap. If a woman's experiencing desire difficulties, she's also likely to experience arousal problems and orgasm problems, difficulty having intercourse, and pain. And so these are major factors for for women in terms of the overlap. And so if we look at the actual frequency, this is a general population sample, you can see that women, a large number of women experience sexual problems. So somewhere between a third and a half of women are experiencing some form of sexual problem. And the reason why we've got 50% and a third is because of this level of overlap. So if women are experiencing desire problems, they're also highly likely to be experiencing arousal problems and perhaps also satisfaction problems. It's unlikely for women if they experience just a simple sexual problem. What are the factors that relate to, that separate sexually functional women from dysfunctional women? Women are much more likely to be dysfunctional if they've had distressing sexual experiences in childhood, if their current attitudes to sex are negative, if they don't enjoy sex, if they've got high levels of performance anxiety, so that they feel that they are in a sexual situation they need to perform. Poor body image, stress, and depression and anxiety. So we've got here some of those individual problems as well as historical problems that relate to sexual dysfunction in women. Also, they have got quite significant problems in their relationships, not just in a particular area. Not that I say that being in a longer relationship is a problem, but women who are in relationships for a longer period of time are more likely to be sexually dysfunctional, and we can talk about that in questions afterwards if you want. They place less importance on sex. Their partner is likely to have also a sexual problem. And then we've got this relationship satisfaction is low, they have difficulty resolving conflict, and they have low levels of intimacy. So we've got a whole lot of different aspects of the relationship that are experiencing difficulties that are present within women with sexual dysfunction. For men, these are the problems that men experience, primarily erectile problems and premature ejaculation. Some men, but a much lower number of men, experience multiple types of sexual dysfunction. Men have fewer problems. They're less relaxed about initiating sex. In terms of their relationships, it's generally relationships in general. They're less confident and they have lower sexual esteem. In a community-based sample, they've got reductions in sexual satisfaction, lower quality of life, more distress and interpersonal difficulties. Just skip through this. And so you can see that a relationship problem is present within male problems and female problems. The guy is wanting treatment for the problem, the woman is saying no. And so what we have here is some kind of relationship misunderstanding occurring. So if we just sum up with this, relationship issues are likely to contribute to sexual dysfunction and sexual problems for both men and women and lead to problems in the relationship generally. The sexual dysfunction, unfortunately, has often been in place for a longer period of time before treatment is sought. And so both partners have adjusted their lives. And so they have this sexual problem, but they have adjusted their lives in relation to that problem. So if we're going to treat sexual dysfunction, there's a need for a recognition of relationship factors that are associated with the sexual dysfunction, much more likely to be the case for women than for men. There's need to be an assessment of these factors and treatment of these factors. So we need to not just treat the sexual problem, but we need to treat the relationship problem as well. Thank you.
Next speaker is Professor Dan Rice from Iowa State University and a Deakin thinker in residence at present.
Okay. Jerry asked me to talk about work we've done over the years on loneliness. It's interesting for me because Carolyn has been involved in this research, but so was Dan Perlman. Meaning, I'm going to tell you that we started this research a long, long time ago, back when I was in graduate school, which was a long, long time ago. And first of all, I thought I would show you, talk a bit about the UCLA loneliness scale, which, yes, indeed, we developed when I was in graduate school. And these are some of the statements from the scale. And these statements, the negative statements here, like how often do you feel alone, for example, came from how lonely people describe the experience. And the scale does not include the word loneliness. And that we did that because we quickly found out that people may be very biased in reporting on a negative experience, particularly men, like loneliness. And so, again, this is the measure, and one thing I will tell you, if you're planning on developing a measure like this is, you can never get away from it. Meaning, people are using this measure a lot, and so each day I'm sending copies of the scale out to people. Now, one important distinction I would like to make is between loneliness and social isolation. That is, it's been our argument from the beginning of this work that loneliness is not the same as social isolation. That, for example, some individuals, and a lot of this research initially we began with college students, and so some college students may report having a large number of close friends and yet be lonely, and vice versa. That is, some individuals may indicate they have very few close friends, but they're not lonely. And the idea is that we came up with from all of this is that basically loneliness occurs when your relationships with others don't meet your expectations. And those expectations can be based on relationships that you've had in the past. So we would see, for example, college students coming to UCLA, and many of them would report high levels of loneliness, even though they were very well adjusted socially in high school. And also another thing that affects your expectations are the relationships that you see other people having. Now, and by the way, this will all be you'll be tested on this after the presentation. But this shows data from college students again on the number of close friends that they reported and their levels of loneliness. And one point I want to make is, so here we have people who report a large number of close friends, yet a number of them also report being lonely. On the other hand, there are people who report very few close friends and report not being lonely. And again, what this illustrates is the fact that loneliness and social isolation are not the same thing. Now, another stereotype, I guess we would say, that we have about loneliness is that it's something that's commonly experienced among the elderly. And in fact, one of the reasons why we started out studying college students is, in fact, in terms of the general population, high school students and college students are the groups that report highest levels of loneliness. These are data from a survey we did in Iowa, a random sample of the population in, I think, 2005. And what you can see is that, in fact, the highest levels of loneliness are reported by, if you will, the younger, or I guess we'd say middle-aged adult population, whereas for the, quote, elderly or older adults, as I get older, I start calling them different things, report lower levels of loneliness. Now, I managed to get some data from a survey done at Deakin. And this is part of the Australian Unity Wellbeing Index, which is an ongoing study that's done, I believe, every year, but don't quote me on that. And Bob Cummins and Melissa Weinberg gave me access to this data. And they used in one of their surveys some items from the loneliness scale. And what you can see is, again, the loneliest groups here from this Australia sample were individuals between 30 and 49 years of age, whereas among the older adults, we see much lower levels of loneliness. Now, one thing I think is very interesting is that the shift occurs a decade earlier in Australia. What does that mean? I have no idea. If you have some ideas, let me know. Another thing that seems to be happening, and again, this is from 2 studies we did in Iowa, is that among older adults, loneliness seems to be increasing. Now, in the U.S., we have, what we refer to as the baby boom generation, and it appears that as they get older, we're getting higher levels of loneliness being reported. And again, so there seem to be generational differences, and it may be that the nature of people's relationships are changing. That is, as you probably have seen here in Australia, people are moving more, they may have less contact with family and friends. That may be what's going on here in terms of these generational changes. Now, I'm convinced part of why people have been very interested in conducting research on loneliness has to do with the consequences of loneliness. And what we have found is that the research is indicating that loneliness has an impact on indicators of mental and physical health. So a number of studies have found that loneliness predicts the development of depression. Now, another thing that can happen, of course, is that people who are depressed, that may disrupt their relationships with other people. So it can certainly also be a cause of loneliness. We've also found that loneliness is associated with a variety of physical health problems, like high blood pressure, sleep disorders, and decrements in immune system functioning. In research that we have done at in Iowa, there was a large sample of 3,000 elderly Iowans from 2 rural counties where I managed to slip in some loneliness questions when they began this study in 1981. And one of the things we found using data from that study was that after controlling for other healthcare problems, loneliness was associated with going into the nursing home. Indeed, it looked like people were going into the nursing home seeking relationships with other people. Another thing that we found was that loneliness predicted mortality over the next 13 years. And over that period of time, about half the sample died. And what's interesting is that these effects appeared to vary depending upon the cause of death. So for example, this is showing loneliness predicting mortality due to heart disease. It also predicted mortality due to respiratory disease. And you can see there that, there's almost a tripling of the rate as you go from low to high levels of loneliness. But interestingly enough, loneliness was not related to mortality due to cancer. Now again, I should emphasize that here we see this association. Why is that happening? If you look at other research on loneliness, and in particular, how it affects indicators such as blood pressure and immune system functioning, it's not too surprising that we see these kinds of relationships. But it's important, I think, to try to understand why these associations are occurring. Now, in terms of future research issues, one thing I've been doing this summer, even though it's actually your winter, is working with a health insurance company from the United States. And they're very interested in looking at interventions for the elderly population that they insure, interventions for loneliness. If you look at the literature on interventions for loneliness, they don't seem to work very well. There are some significant effects with certain kinds of interventions, but importantly, one of the things I've learned in looking at that literature is most of those studies have not been interventions with people who are very lonely. And so that's an important issue. If loneliness is having these negative effects on mental and physical health, developing interventions to impact that is important. The other thing that I would point out is that it's important to look at the role of the internet and other technology, both in terms of interventions for loneliness and to understand how that may affect interpersonal relationships. If you're communicating with your friends and family via Facebook, which I've learned how to do since coming to Australia in May, how does that impact the quality of those relationships? I think that's an important issue. There is evidence that people who use in particular Facebook a lot tend to be more lonely. And so the technology may not work out that well. So let me stop there, and again, we can talk about other aspects of this later on. Thank you.
our next speaker, also from Iowa State University, and I think we're residents, Professor Carol Petrone.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. Being a thinker in residence at Deakin University has clearly been one of the most wonderful experiences of my life. So my great thanks to both Marita and Jerry for allowing that to happen for myself and Dan. My voice is a little strained. We went tramping in New Zealand and I brought back some kind of respiratory problem, but let me turn to my remarks about social support. So I've been studying social support for roughly 34 or 35 years. And in the beginning of my career, social support was wonderful. All these wonderful health effects, mental health effects. You know, you couldn't say enough good things about social support. In recent years, the literature has showed lots of disappointments when you actually look at specific behaviors that people engage in, intending to be supportive. They don't always work out. So let me talk a little bit about this seeming paradox. So I'll talk briefly, I'll give you a definition of social support, and then talk about the benefits of perceived social support, the belief that you have adequate social support if you need it, surprising failures of specific supportive acts, talk a little bit about what goes wrong, and then just a bit about how we can be more effective helpers. So first, a definition of social support. Very simply, resources, psychological primarily, but sometimes tangible, resources we receive from the people in our lives, especially during times of duress. My favorite conceptual framework for social support comes from Robert Weiss, who came up with a list of what he called social provisions that are required for people to feel happy and fulfilled in their lives with other people. So the first provision is attachment, emotional closeness and caring. Second, reassurance of worth, expressions of confidence in our competence and value. Guidance, information and advice. And I've given an example of how we measure this perceived social support, and I picked guidance as the example. Are there people you can turn to for advice when you need it? So that's an example of how you measure perceived social support. Additional provisions, reliable alliance, assistance with tasks, or providing tangible resources. You're going to be evicted from your flat and someone loans you money so you can pay your rent and not be evicted, would be one example of tangible assistance. Social integration, a sense of belonging to a group of others, companionship, people with whom you share common interests and values. And then finally, opportunity to provide nurturance. Being needed by others is another very important component of what we derive from our relationships with others. So 40 years of research documents a great many health benefits that are associated with the perception that if you need it, social support is available. Less likely people with high levels of perceived social support are less likely to develop cardiovascular disease. Among people with cardiovascular disease, the disease proceeds more slowly. Lower plaque buildup, lower blood pressure, lower cardiac reactivity. Lower rates of mortality from cardiovascular disease, cancer, and infectious disease. So lots and lots of studies, hundreds of studies out there that show that people who report a high level of perceived social support are doing better in their mental health and their physical health. All right, so that's the good news. However, when we measure the occurrence of specific supportive acts, someone offers good advice on how you should solve a problem, for example. How many times in the past week did someone give you advice about a problem you were having? Is one way we would measure received support. So we're indexing the frequency of specific supportive acts. The results are quite different for received support versus perceived support. So higher received support, where we're tallying the frequency of specific acts, has been associated with higher levels of mortality in a number of studies. There's a very well-known study by Bolger and colleagues where couples were asked to keep track on a daily basis for 2 weeks of whether or not they received different kinds of support from their partner. One member of each of these couples was preparing for the bar exam. That is the exam in the US that allows you to practice law. Very important, and a lot of people fail it. So this is a very high anxiety situation. And what Niall Bolger and colleagues found was that on the day following receiving support from your partner, the person who was preparing for the exam felt worse, felt more depressed. So receiving support, reporting that you received support from your partner on day 1 was associated with higher levels of depression on day 2. And I don't think Bolger or anybody else expected that. Another famous, very recent study, not famous, another very recent study that I found looked at receiving advice on job opportunities. In the US, we've gone through and are finally recovering from a terrible period excuse me, of unemployment. And I think that you've had similar problems, perhaps to a lesser degree here. So this study looked at what's the impact of receiving a job tip from another person. Well, it turns out that in this study, people were more depressed if they had reported they had received a tip about a job opportunity. So let me talk about some possible explanations for why perceived social support, is so beneficial. And then we'll talk about some ideas about why received specific instances of social support may not succeed. So people who report high levels of perceived social support, according to Uchino, I think, who has come up with some nice ideas here, may have had experiences in their lives, like the experiences that Jeffrey Simpson was talking about, that allow them to draw other people to them, to appreciate people and earn the appreciation of others, to view the world positively, especially the interpersonal world. That sounds just like secure attachment to me. Work cooperatively with others, and behave in general in a competent, effective manner when confronting stress. So it may be that early interpersonal experiences shape people to have a positive outlook, to actually attract people who will provide good quality support, and to just be competent in the world. That it's a whole constellation of characteristics that include the perception that others are available for them. So that may be why perceived social support is associated with such good outcomes. All right, what about the failures of received social support? The first I'll call reverse causation, that when people are in worse condition, they're more depressed, they're sicker, more people rally to their support. So that also could result in a positive correlation between people being more troubled, sicker, and getting more support. However, the research does not support that being the complete explanation. People have done experimental studies of social support, and well-controlled experimental studies and longitudinal studies where you actually control for the severity of stress that people are experiencing, doesn't explain this effect. So what other explanations could there be? So people believe, I think certainly in the US and I think in most countries, that they should solve their own problems. Maybe not in most countries, but in many, a large subset of countries. When others offer help, one thing it does is it heightens awareness of our own problem. Boy, they're being really nice to me. Oh, it's because I'm having problems. Oh, I'm having problems. Heightens awareness. Communicates a message of incompetence. Here, let me do that for you. Why? You don't think I can do it myself? So, a message of implied inefficacy. Generates feelings of indebtedness. Gee, maybe the other person will expect me to reciprocate in some way. And a communication of lower status. You are one up from me if you are in the position of offering me resources. So it hurts our pride, I think. So the types of social support that are most likely to fail include advice and include tangible assistance. Now, we've done lots of observational studies of couples giving support to one another. Almost all they do is give each other advice. So that seems to be our first impulse. Less likely to go wrong are listening and expressions of concern. So, what applications to living a life of more successful social support? One is to help your child to develop a view of the world as a place where people can be relied upon, fostering that secure attachment style by being a reliable source of assistance in times of need, being a consistent source of security. When someone you care about is stressed, listen first. Express caring and encouragement. Ask if there's any way in which you can be helpful. Sometimes it's surprising what the other person wants. Don't tell me what to do. Just let me vent. Let me figure this out. Let me just talk. Let me just talk and figure it out myself. Incidentally, any kind of help that limits the other person's freedom of choice seems to be more problematic. Don't force assistance on someone who doesn't want it. And offer help as an equal. Remind the stressed person that he or she would and probably will do the same for you someday. Let me stop there. Thank you for your attention.
I would like to just set the scene very, very briefly as an introduction. When I started my research program on relationships many years ago, I was struck at that point about how little really as social psychologists we understood about human relationships and how they work. And in particular, how little we understood about emotions and feelings, which any layperson will tell you it really goes to the guts of close relationships. Relationships give structure to our life, but really it's our emotions, our feelings of love and anger and guilt and grief and shame and jealousy that give life its meaning. So really they're at the core of relationships, and that's what I became interested in studying. And in particular, I wanted to focus as time went on the impact of emotions in terms of when people are trying to deal with very difficult events in their relationships and how they go about repairing their relationships, so issues of betrayal and forgiveness, the kinds of emotions that go along with that, and the way that people think about these events and how those thoughts impact their feelings and their behaviours. So that is a brief background to the research program. Really, what are the causes and consequences of emotional experiences in relationships, and in particular today, I'm talking about betrayal and punishment and forgiveness, because they're all part of this process, a kind of dance that goes on between partners, inevitably at times in relationships. What is betrayal? I have to quote from the Macquarie Dictionary because I come from Macquarie University. We used to own it and we gave it to Sydney University. It's a political story I won't go into. But we're very proud of Macquarie Dictionary, and so here is the definition. I've truncated a little bit. You can see to be disloyal, to be unfaithful, to deceive or to mislead, to disappoint the hopes and expectations of another. And this is key, and as we've heard from our other speakers, some of you will have noticed people have been talking about expectations. We really live our relationships so much inside our own heads. We are a function of what we've grown up and what we've learned about relationships, and those theories, those schemas, as Jeff was talking about, as Marita, as all our panel have been talking about, we're acquiring these rules about relationships and how they work and who we are in relationships. And betrayal is no exception. When we perceive that someone's broken the rules, a relationship rule, that's perceived as a betrayal. And when we do research in this area, we find that betrayal is not just about infidelity. People talk about betrayal involving deception, being lied to, being abused, being not considered, being not taken seriously, a partner taking their parents' or third parties' views as more important than their own. Really what we're talking about then, unkindness, we're talking about a perception that your partner has done something to signal to you that they didn't really care about you or the relationship as much as you had believed or hoped or wanted. And the reactions to that perception, all right, because my expectations have been violated, is hurt. How could this happen? And people talk about it. The response is a kick in the stomach, a feeling of terrible shock, followed often by anger. It's not fair, it's not right, how can you do this? Sadness, what have I lost? Fear and anxiety, what's going to happen next? Is this the end of the road for us? Relief sometimes. I knew something was wrong. I knew that he'd been having an affair for 10 years, kept telling me I was mad. I knew it. I was right. Can be traumatic, deeply distressing. So the kinds of emotions that people feel in response to betrayal, in fact, have been likened to post-traumatic shock. So depending on the severity of that betrayal, people can be deeply, deeply wounded. So the interesting question then is, of course, how do people get through betrayal? Can betrayal be forgiven? Can a couple get to the other side of a betrayal? Well, in fact, they can, and we know from a lot of our research that forgiveness is not a one-stop thing that happens to people. It's a process, and it involves emotions, and it involves a lot of thinking, a lot of commitment, and a lot of time. And so people often don't quite appreciate that. When a partner says, I'm sorry, and you want to forgive them, you want to let it go, what your head might say, let it go, your heart often isn't ready at all. And in one of the studies that I was doing, a man in his 80s talked about his betrayal of his wife some 30 years earlier and his efforts to regain her love and trust, which took fully 2 years. Of going way beyond verbal apologies, but actually acting in a way to signal to her, I was wrong and I really want this relationship, I value it and I love you, and this is how much work I'm prepared into showing you that I mean it. Okay, so forgiveness, people often talk about it means letting go of resentment and hurt. That can often, sometimes it doesn't mean reconciliation. Sometimes a relationship is not going to be repaired. Sometimes you're going to have to let it go. And at that point, really forgiveness also comes down to what anger and hate and anxiety and all those kinds of very negative emotions, what are they doing to you? At some point, self-forgiveness and self-compassion really becomes the most urgent or the most important feature. Now, is there a role for punishment in the forgiveness process? We've seen from some of the clinical work, in the early work, people were assuming that forgiveness was antithetical to revenge and punishment. They can't exist together. If you've forgiven somebody, then you're not taking revenge on them, you don't punish them. What we have found in terms of this process is that there is a role for punishment and everybody does it. So even in the happiest relationships, when you perceive that your partner has broken the rules, your impulse is to let them know about it, to express your hurt, to make sure they're aware of your suffering, and people will communicate their hurt. And so we know that happier couples tend to punish in more or less adaptive ways. They will remind the partner every so often about, don't forget what you did, I hope you're not going to do that again. Sometimes it comes down to teasing, but there's a kind of statute of limitations on it. So at some point, people close the book, if you like, on that offence. However, unhappier couples seem to think this is the rule has been broken, we can't get past this, and so they tend to take revenge and punish in much more destructive ways. And that includes abuse and sometimes violence, and often separation. I can't bear it, the rule has been broken, and so the only way out for us now is divorce, separation. That was an unforgivable rule that you've broken the relationship. And we know from our studies that so many people, well, certainly a sizable number, who divorced as a function of one partner's misbehaviour, will say afterwards, after a few years, you know, we could have got through that, and I wish we had, gave up too soon, all right? So that the feelings are so strong. All right, what makes forgiveness more likely? We know that sincere remorse from the betrayer is crucial, but it goes beyond verbal apologies. That betrayer has to demonstrate a certain amount of pain, so I have to be willing to accept some punishment from you in order to signal my commitment to the relationship. And the betrayed also, though, because this is a bit of a dance, it's a dyadic process, as a betrayed person, I need to know when to stop punishing and to accept that you've been sorry enough and let you off the hook. And we know that, although this is a bit of a buzzword, emotional intelligence, we know that there is a role for emotion understanding in this process. Emotional intelligence, apart from being a sort of pop psychology buzzword, in the more scientific context, it involves being able to understand emotions and to be able to regulate emotions and to understand and empathise with one another's thoughts and feelings. And to the extent that people are good at this, they can do this, then they're better able to identify their own responses in light of a betrayal, and also to be empathic to their partner's responses. And this seems to be a functional or an adaptive response. So they're able to make more adaptive responses in the light of betrayal. All right, so just summing up, maintaining loving relationships is very difficult when bad things happen, but the price of giving up can be very high, and some people wish they hadn't given up. Betrayal is to a certain extent a function of our schemas, our theories about how we should be, how our relationships should work. As Jeff and others have pointed out, some of those lessons we learned in early life are dysfunctional. They're not healthy expectations, but we believe they're right. This is what I think, so it's right. May not be. In the search for perfect love and the perfect relationship partner, we may end up alone in what is, of course, can be a very lonely world. So know that we are imperfect and our loved ones make mistakes, and the strength of our own feelings is actually a signal of how much we care. That is really the first step, I think, to forgiveness and relationship repair. And it's also encouraging to know that emotional intelligence can be learned. We can actually learn to better understand and recognise and articulate our emotions, and that in turn helps us to be empathic and compassionate to others.
Okay, everyone, we might now look at opening it up for questions. Thank you so much again to our speakers. We'll have formal thanks again at the end, but we'll open it now to the audience. So any questions you have of any of us as panel, Maria is going to be bringing the mic around. She can take questions, as can the rest of the panel members. We've got a mic that I'll give them shortly, so feel free to ask some questions if you wish. The floor is yours.
Otherwise, we'll start asking you questions.
Thanks. This is probably for Professor Russell. We know that when people are in love, hormones affect the brain. But with loneliness, how is the body affected at a biological, medical level?
Okay, I'm probably the worst person to ask that of. As I mentioned, there is fairly clear, consistent evidence of loneliness affecting immune system functioning and some other biological processes. Okay, now in terms of, and by that I mean, indicators associated with heart disease or anxiety, problems with sleep, and so forth, which suggest high levels of arousal, perhaps. Beyond that, I'm not aware of other work. If you think of, issues like brain activity, that might occur as a consequence of loneliness. Well, again, you may see patterns of brain activity as a consequence of, say, the emotional reactions like depression or anxiety. But going beyond that, I think that's completely unclear. Now, on the other hand, when people talk about these associations with mortality and so forth, and particular causes of death, I'm left with, okay, so what is the process? What is the biological process? And is it, for example, different from what you might see if you look at individuals who are very depressed? One of the concerns I have with a lot of the research that's gone on is that they'll find an association between loneliness and this or that outcome, be it biological or health related. but they're not considering whether or not that can be explained by levels of depression. And I raise that because they're certainly highly correlated. Also, if you look at other indicators of relationship status, like social support, for example, there's very strong negative correlations between loneliness and levels of social support. So is this a general reaction to the quality of our relationships with other people? That's unclear. So I think what the current research leaves us with is the need to further pursue these kinds of intervening processes. And I see that as an important direction to go in, and that, particularly the work that John Cassioppo's been doing in the U.S., linking loneliness with a variety of health-related consequences. I think that the basis for doing that research and moving forward in terms of these biological processes is there. But at the same time, I think you have to look at other aspects of relationships that these individuals have with other people in order to make sure that it is loneliness per se that's important, and not simply a consequence of depression or various kinds of very specific deficits in your relationships with other people. So I hope that that's helpful.
First of all, thank you very much for very succinct and enjoyable presentations. And the question that I have is that there's a growing body of research on mixed orientation relationships, polyamorous relationships, and I seem to get the assumption, or there was an assumption, that your research is based on heteronormative, monogamous or heterosexual relationships. And the research on polyamorous or mixed orientation relationships often concurs and or contests your findings. So I'm really interested if you've engaged with mixed orientation and polyamorous relationships or same-sex relationships.
So what do you mean by mixed orientation? I'm sorry.
My recent research is on relationships where one partner is bisexual identifying, the other partner may be straight identifying. They may be identifying across sexuality, so someone could be gay identifying or lesbian identifying, but in an opposite sex relationship. And it's really interesting how these issues come to play.
That's great. That's very, very interesting that you're doing research. Is this not on? Oh, okay. Closer. So what I was going to say, you may miss what you're asking, but research on same-sex couples shows that exactly the same processes seem to be operating, that the same kinds of characteristics that attract heterosexual to non-heterosexual same-sex couples seem to operate using the same kinds of standards. What predicts a very happy, long-standing same-sex relationship, the same kinds of factors that affect opposite sex couples. But the difference is in the environmental stress that couples that are not normative have to experience. So we happen to have, Dan and I are married, we happen to have a lesbian daughter. And so her relationships are always in the context of stress, of non-acceptance. We happen to live in a state where same-sex marriage is legal, and they got married in our living room and have a child now, so it's all nice. But I think what you're doing is pioneering, and that I will await with great eagerness what you find.
Yeah, the other thing that I'd add to that, and I agree, I think some of the work you're doing is very pioneering. There's been quite a bit of work that's been done by Lawrence Kerdek that's looked at same-sex couples and has compared them to heterosexual couples. And in a recent textbook chapter that we had to review, we had to comment on this. And what we would say is, I think the point that Carol makes around stressors around the normative way that we do relationships, we may see some influences there. I think the work is yet to be done. But I think if we look at what we want in a partner and how a lot of these relationship processes do go down, they don't seem very different. And the assumption around doing that research is that we would find differences. So the hypothesis is that there would be, but we didn't find them. And then when you think about it retrospectively, you go, well, why should it be? If we get into long-term intimate relationships, and we all have a need for love, comfort, and understanding,
Sex is important to all of us. Intimacy is. Some of these things may not play out to the degree of difference that we may perceive. One of the questions we often get is, if it's a same-sex couple, things must be different. And that's not always the case. And in fact, the data, at least to this point, would suggest otherwise.
Hi, this one's for Dan.
That's good.
As a social researcher who looks at patterns of behaviour, I'm very interested in your wellbeing index and the fact that you found higher levels of loneliness amongst 30 to 39 and 40 to 49-year-olds in Australia. Is there any correlation that anybody knows about between the level of loneliness at that age and the level of divorce at that age and the level of infidelity that's reported in those age groups?
Again, that is not something that we have looked at. On the other hand, if you, again, you guys are from Australia, not me. But those are times, at least in the United States, when you see these kinds of processes, events tend to happen, and that certainly could lead to a disruption in relationships, and in turn, loneliness occurring. The one thing I will say is, in general, loneliness, in the work we've done, and there hasn't been a lot, tends to be fairly stable over time, in the population as a whole. And what I've not seen is a lot of research where what you do is follow individuals when they're experiencing those kinds of events and looking at not just indicators of depression or life satisfaction, but indicators of loneliness. And then in turn, what about recovery? So if a close relationship ends, divorce or whatever, presumably you would see increases in loneliness, but do you in turn see them, recover, new relations and so forth? And that's what you would anticipate. What is the kind of time interval there? I don't know. And that's something I'm preparing to do with longitudinal data that we have now. We've been involved in a study of African American families, and that sample, after we followed them now for about 15 years, their average age is around 50. And we've been measuring loneliness over time. So we're in a position to be able to do that kind of research. So I see that as an open question, and in turn, can that account for these kind of cohort or generational differences we tend to see? I doubt it. And by that I mean, here we're looking at the mean for these samples as a whole, and not for individuals. So I suspect there's more to it than that. And it may have to do with the nature of relationships and how families are changing, that's affecting those generations. Or it may simply have to do with, what I saw in Iowa when we first started doing this work is, I just felt like, we were dealing with, particularly the elderly, the populations that weren't willing to own up to these negative feelings. Or if they experiencing them, or they don't experience them as often or as strong. And that we're, with the baby boomers, if you will, people like me, that we're more willing to own up to some of these feelings than, say, our parents' generation was. So I had some sense that that was what was going on. But now we're seeing, differences between folks of my age and then, younger adult populations. And so what's going on there, it's unclear. And again, it would be very interesting not just to look at this in the US and Australia, but in other countries, and to see if we see similar patterns and to try to understand by doing research across countries what's involved in these differences we see by age.
We've got time for one more question.
I was wondering if there is any research done with regard to what we are looking for in a partner, depending on how many relationships you have had.
Over the years, we've done some work on a construct called sociosexuality, which is basically the extent to which you feel comfortable having sex without love, and people who score high on the scale are more likely to have multiple relationships, maybe serially multiple relationships. And we've done a little bit of work looking at them in relation to people who say, I can only have sex if I really am bonded to and love somebody. And those individuals, are more likely to have fewer relationships that are more committed across time. And what you basically find is that both men and women look for, do you remember Jerry's 3 categories of partner networks? They're more likely to place more weight on attractiveness and vitality, and a little bit more weight on status and resources, and they downplay the importance of warmth and trustworthiness. That's what they'll tell you, and that's what they look for. But what often happens is when they get into a long-term relationship, or it becomes long-term, because they haven't chosen for trustworthiness and warmth, that's a deficit that they experience. And so one of the reasons why these people, perhaps, move in and out of relationships is because they're not choosing partners in a balanced way in all 3 dimensions, and they realize, well, this person I do connect with emotionally and otherwise, but I don't feel I can trust them, or I don't feel like a warm connection with them. And so their initial criteria of selection may lead them to the relationships that fail across time, when they shift from a short-term focus to a more long-term focus.
Well, one of the things that I said in opening was that relationships can be problematic. And I think we've seen in this presentation, set of presentations, both the good and the bad. Relationships basically can be complicated, even in presentations that were fairly broad and didn't get into a lot of complications. We can see that there's the positive and the negative side. I think one of the things that we should say is that quality counts in relationships. I go back to Jeff's presentation. One of the things that I think is really crucial in that is these early developmental experiences that we've had, and particularly I think in the last 20 or so years, we've seen the tremendous importance of this notion of attachment, and that we have different perceptions of what relationships are going to be like, and if we see other people as being reliable and helpful to us, that our relationships are likely to be better. The final thought that I want to leave you with, though, is I've looked at relationships for a long time in my life, and there is the negative. I've written on the dark side of relationships, but ultimately I'm a relationship junkie. I think ultimately relationships are essential to our lives, and on balance, the answer is that they're good. You may have to work at them a little bit, but I wish you the very best in your